They were capturing Americans, forcing them back into the Royal British Navy. They were telling us who we could trade with and what we could trade. Well, it was that impressment of the sailors into the Navy like that that actually started that whole war. The area that we're in together right now is known as Misery Bay. It used to be known as Little Bay, though. It got its new name after that victorious squadron returned back from the Battle of Lake Erie, and the reason is this. When they came back on these two big brigs, these two big warships, the Lawrence and the Niagara, and they were trying to take them back to a naval yard, which was clear on the other side of the bay over here. Well, it was very, very difficult to do, and they were exhausted, so they decided that they would just overwinter here in this part of the bay. Well, if you know anything about our winters here in Erie, you know we get an awful lot of snow. In fact, this last winter, we won second place in the National Snow Globe Awards. I'm not so sure we're celebrating that, but I guess at least we got something out of it. Also, it's bitterly cold here at times, and those conditions were very harsh for those men out on these boats, let alone those boats weren't meant for continuous human occupation. To put all of it in perspective, we lost 25 men over there in Sandusky during the Battle of Lake Erie. We lost an additional 12 here in this part of the bay, just from those harsh winter conditions, nearly half as many. So that's why they renamed us Misery Bay. The area that's directly ahead of you here is known as Montfort International Terminal. It's also the home of Erie Sand and Gravel. You might be able to figure that out just from the piles you see over here. This area was once just part of the bay, but they filled it in so that there would be a place for large freighters like this one to dock when they come into port. We get some massive ships, as you can see here, and they make their ways through the waterways, sometimes all the way as far as from the oceans. That large yellow crane you see on the right over there behind everything, that is the largest crane on all the Great Lakes. That one has a 300-ton lift on it, and they use that to pick up locomotives. And then they'll place those on barges, and those locomotives are taken as far as China and India. Those locomotives are actually manufactured right here in Erie at the Wabtec plant. They used to be known as GE Transportation. Often we'll see the St. John over here. There's probably no room for her right now. She's our sand dredging vessel. She also may be out on the lake working, so we might pass her while we're out today. She's part of our sand replenishment operations here. As leaves go crashing on the beaches, they take sand with them back out into the lake, and that causes beach erosion here. So the St. John will go on into designated areas of the lake, suck up sand from the bottom, and then bring it back and put it over here at the terminal, where then it's eventually picked up by a really big barge with a huge conveyor belt, and that carries it across the channel over to Presque side, 30,000 tons at a time. And then eventually we take that by the truckload back to the beaches to replenish those beaches from beach erosion. It's a pretty efficient operation they have going here. The waves take the sand up into the lake, the St. John sucks it back up off the bottom, and we put it back on the beaches again. We just keep recycling that same sand. Those are wind turbine blades that you see there, those big windmills. They're massive. They're beautiful. And probably coming here to be picked up by the truckload to take them to New York. Oh, jeez. You should be up front with that with some of the stuff you bring in. That's a pretty big boat, huh? Oh, really?
Look at that shipping truck in there, the boat.
The captain's slowing down here, and he's going to reverse the engines in a moment, and that's just to clean off some of the seaweed and other plant life we pick up on the propeller over there in that shallow, weedy bay. It'll give us a smoother ride while we're out today. We've just entered what's known as the channel here. This is the permanent entrance to the harbor here at Presque, and this is actually the deepest water we're going to be in together today. I wasn't totally kidding when I said we could probably stand on top of the boat if it went down. This is only 32 feet deep here, and this is as deep as we're going to get. This actually has to be dredged, which means dug deeper, so those big commercial vessels like the BBC over there can actually pass through here safely. They have to dredge it every couple of years to keep it deep enough. But the first time they ever did that was all the way back in 1827. It was one of the first jobs ever given to the Army Corps of Engineers. Prior to that, though, back in Commodore Perry's time, this was just sort of a meandering stream through here. It was only about 4 or 5 feet deep. Well, that was a bit of a problem for Commodore Perry and his men because they had their fleet of ships built all the way on the other side of the bay over there. And they had those 2 big warships, those 2 big brigs, the Lawrence and the Niagara built over there. Well, both of those boats drew a depth of about 8 or 9 feet. This was 4 or 5. So they had to figure out how to get those boats through this shallow water out onto the lake for the war. The first thing they thought they'd try was just to lighten the load on those ships. They thought they'd take off the supplies like the guns and the ammunition. They even ended up removing the masts and the rigging off those ships, but it wasn't enough. So the next thing they thought they'd try was this Dutch innovation called camels. And no, those aren't the animals you ride in Egypt through the sand. I don't think they swim, last I checked. These are barges that they would fill with water, and then they would rise and sink depending on the amounts in them. And then they ran sweeps out the side where the oars typically go and put those camels underneath to try to push those boats up out of the water to give them more buoyancy. But even that was still not enough. So what they ended up having to do is what's called kedging the vessels. And what that means is they took the anchor, threw it in a dinghy, a much smaller boat, and then they sent that dinghy out ahead and cranked the anchor rope by hand, essentially pulling those ships by hand all the way to the harbor. It took them 72 hours to pull the Lawrence there. By that time, they sort of had a little bit of a system in place, I guess, so it took them a little less time, but it still took them 24 hours to get the Niagara there. I imagine they were completely wiped out by the time they arrived. And unfortunately for Commodore Perry and his men, their troubles weren't over yet. When they arrived at the harbor, they found that some of the British fleet were there blocking their way. Well, Commodore Perry was kind of a lucky guy. Most of the British had gone on to Canada to resupply, and when they arrived, the Canadians were like, hey, you guys are doing a bang-up job there, Erie. Why don't you hang out and celebrate with us for a while? And they were like, sure, we have no worries there in Erie. They're never going to get those ships through that shallow water. We'll stay and party. And so they did. Well, Commodore Perry took advantage of that situation. He sent a couple of his fastest schooners out to distract the British that were still here, and while their backs were turned, he slipped his fleet out onto the lake. The Lawrence was completely supplied. It was ready to go for battle, but the Niagara wasn't ready at all. Thankfully, the British didn't know that, though, so Commander Barclay of the British fleet decided not to engage. So Commodore Perry and his men were very lucky. Not too long after that, they made their way over there to Sandusky, Ohio, and fought that Battle of Lake Erie, and, well, the rest is actually history. This area extends over here on your left-hand side out to the tip of the peninsula. You can kind of see it back there. It's that sandy beach area. That is known as Gull Point. We're going to get a lot closer to that shortly. And then also over here on your right-hand side and up ahead, this is the east side of Erie over here. Erie's east coast. Sunset tours. Right now they're leaving at 7:30 p.m. They get a little earlier as the season goes on because the sunset gets earlier. But I do recommend you book those in advance.
down and only get your feet damp. That's a whole lot of fish. We had 144 commercial fishing tanks out here, and there were 16 processing plants in the city. Give me 1 second. Those are the Rangers. Well, we had 144 commercial fishing types out here and those processing plants, and they were commercially fishing for whitefish, herring, sturgeon, and blue pike. You can imagine we had quite the fishing economy here. A lot of jobs in that industry, not just on the tugs and processing plants, but also the supporting industry around that, like dock workers, warehousing, the parts and supplies and maintenance for all that, and even ice making. Unfortunately, it wasn't well managed. They were over-harvesting. They were pulling way too many fish out of the lake. Also, there was no pollution control back then, and so a lot of people were dumping in this lake, and that was killing off a whole lot of fish. And then a lot of land development was taking place, and in doing so, they were destroying the wetlands. And that's where the natural fish hatcheries are. So all those things in combination pretty much brought that industry to a halt. There's no significant commercial fishing here any longer. Hasn't been for a real long time. Unfortunately, we fished some fish out of the lake too. Blue pike are now extinct. They were a subspecies of walleye. Back then, they were so plentiful that they developed a flash freezing method in the food industry just for this fish. It still gets used on other items and other foods today, but obviously not on them. Also, sturgeon, which are huge, they're like a 6 to 8 foot long fish on average. They're very difficult to find in this lake now. Does anyone know why they fish for sturgeon? It's for their eggs. Their eggs are caviar. Oh, it was really popular. We even had a processing plant right here on Presque across from where beach number 2 is today. They used to take those fish, process them just for their sturgeon, for the sturgeon eggs, the caviar, and then they would discard the remains of that fish into a holding pond outdoors. It was said by mid-August you could smell that holding pond 15 miles away. We're glad that it's gone. Don't imagine we'd be competing with Yellowstone for tourists if that were over here. That area is still referred to as stink hole today. On the map. Thankfully, there's some conservation efforts to try to increase the number of sturgeon back into the lake. Specifically over there in Cleveland, they're doing a breed and release program, so hopefully we'll see them start to recover eventually. And we're just about to the halfway point of our tour here. I see the Presque Lighthouse is starting to peek out here. We'll clear those trees in a moment. We'll turn around at the lighthouse, so if you don't get a good view on this one, you'll get it as we turn around. Both sides of the boat get a nice view. The Presque Lighthouse was built in 1870, but it wasn't lit until July of 1873. When they first lit it, it burned whale oil. Then in the 1950s, they installed an electric generator. It became an electric lighthouse. When they did, the first light bulb they put in there was only 150 watts. Think about your three-way lamp at home and you take that up to the high notch. That's how bright that was. Even back then, it was so dim, the locals poked fun at it. They nicknamed it the flashlight. Today it has a 1,000-watt aircraft peeking in there, and you can see it about 20 miles out on the lake. It's auxiliary backup, and it's managed by the U.S. Coast Guard, so it's a fully functional and use lighthouse today. That house you see below, that used to be the lightkeeper's residence, but it's now a museum that you can tour, and you can also tour that tower as well. There's small fees for building those things. They're open seasonally here. We like to warn everybody about that tower, though, if you do decide you want to do that. There are 78 steps up a spiral staircase in there, so give yourself plenty of time if you're prepared to do some climbing. If you want to check it out, you make a right out of our parking lot, and just keep going. Eventually it'll wind you out here. The cost to build that lighthouse tower was $15,000. Sounds kind of reasonable today, but back in the 1800s, that was an enormous amount of money. And the reason it was so expensive is back then there were no roads on the peninsula, so every brick was brought here by boats. That was pretty costly to do. It had to be built really strong to withstand all the storms and weather that we get out here. So what you're looking at is 5 layers of bricks thick. The outside's obviously square, but there is a rounded layer on the inside to give it extra strength and stability.
And then the path fades out.
The original lightkeeper who worked here made a pretty sad salary. Poor guy only made $520 per year. That's pretty sad, right? It translates to be somewhere around 10 grand for us today. It's awful. What's worse is that poor guy had to climb all those steps, fill the lantern with whatever oil, trim up the wick, and then polish all the lenses, and he had to do that every 6 hours around the clock. $500 some a year. To make matters worse, he lived a lonely existence out here. There were no roads on the peninsula, and he lived all by himself. So the only company he ever got were the supply vessels that would come and bring him his clothing and food, whatever else he needed. And they only came every 6 months. He only saw humans twice a year. Sure hope they brought him a lot of books to read or something. I don't know, decks of cards to play solitaire. I'm thinking on that job application there was a checkoff box. Do you hate people, yes or no? You're hired, right? After some time, though, they started to allow the lightkeepers to bring families with them. And when they did, they almost always had kids, because what else were they going to do out here on the peninsula by themselves, right? The kids then would have to go to school, and there still were no roads here, so the kids would have to trek all the way across the peninsula until they got to the bayside, where then a city rescue boat would pick them up to take them to school. Well, that was fine until the winter, and then the bay completely freezes, so the kids would have to get across that ice to get to school. Well, they figured out a much more fun and clever way to do that after some time. The kids learned to ice skate, so they would ice skate to school. Today in the winter, you can still see people out in the bay on ice skates. We'll also see some ice skiffs out there, which are like sailboats on skis. We also have a whole lot of ice fishing that takes place out on the bay. People will drill holes in the ice, throw their poles in there, and sometimes even build huts around it to stay a little warmer. So we don't shut down here in the winter. We still have some fun winter activities that take place. It's just a little bit colder. It's a whole lot of it colder. 6 with 15 zeros after it. That's a big number, huh? What's that look like in gallons of water? Thankfully, somebody came up with a visual for us to help us make sense of it. They said if you were to take all the water from all 5 Great Lakes and combine that water and then spread it equally over the continental United States, all of us would be standing in 9 feet of water. That's a whole lot of water. But Lake Erie is one of the smaller of the Great Lakes. It's the next to the smallest. Lake Ontario is the little one. And then Lake Superior is the big one. That's how you remember it. It's the Superior Lake, right? In terms of depth, though, how deep the lake is, by far, Lake Erie is the shallowest of all the 5 lakes. On average, we're only 62 feet deep here. Our deepest point is only 212 feet deep. That's on the Long Point, Ontario, Canada. And that's still pretty shallow because when you compare that to the other Great Lakes, especially the bigger ones, they get into the thousands of feet deep. So we're a very shallow lake. From end to end, Lake Erie is 240 miles long. Its widest point is 57 miles. And its narrowest point actually is from here, Presque to that Long Point, Ontario, Canada that I just mentioned. It's another peninsula. And it's only 25 miles. So you're only 25 miles from Canada by water today. That's how those front runners were doing their thing. Also how Mr. Bundy swam there. Can't imagine swimming 25 miles, let alone 1 mile. Something else that's interesting about this lake, though, is its wave action. The waves out here can get dangerous sometimes. We get some really big waves. And the reason it's like this is, when you have a big body of water like the Great Lake, that's so shallow like Lake Erie, the waves tend to be very close together. You can kind of see these little waves we're making with the boat here, the wake. They're pretty close together. Well, when they get bigger, these waves out here don't get a whole lot further apart. When you're out on the ocean, they get massive waves all the time. 15-foot waves are kind of common out there. But they're really, really far apart. So if you're on those waves, you're just kind of bobbing up and down real slow. It's not dangerous. Your stomach may disagree with you on that point, but you'll be okay eventually. Out here in Lake Erie, we get a 15-foot wave though, and we do sometimes. They're this close together. So you go up a wave and down a wave and right back up the next one. That's very dangerous to your boat and crew. We have to be very mindful of the weather here on Lake Erie. It's not uncommon for us to have a day like today, and then if the right summer storm would blow in from the right direction, especially like a nor'easter, we can go to 25+ foot waves out on this lake in a very short period of time. Because of the wave action on this lake, this body of water is known as one of the most treacherous navigable bodies of water in the whole world. Now I tell you, right? Well, there's more to that story. We're in an area known as the Lake Erie Quadrangle. You've all heard of the Bermuda Triangle, right? Well, we have a quadrangle, and you're in it. This is a 2,500 square mile area that extends from here to Conneaut, Ohio, up to Port Vermal, Ontario, and then out weather is coming. We have good storm prediction now. Also, we know when it's windy out here. All the waves out here on the lake are created 100% by wind. We don't have tides or anything out here. We also have buoys out here that report back the wave weights for us. So we just look at our cell phones these days and go, oh, okay. Less than 1 foot waves out here today. This will be a good day. We don't bring the Lady Kate out on this part of the lake even when the waves get over 3 foot. And not because a 4-foot wave would be dangerous or anything, but we would all be very uncomfortable probably and be soaking wet. And probably a little seasick for some people. So we go on other tours that day. We go out into the Bay of Erie. There's a whole lot to see over there. You okay, Bubba? Something else that's interesting about the lake is what's known as its thermocline. And that just talks about how the temperature changes as you go down into the different depths of the water. Well, Lake Erie's thermocline is kind of unique. At the surface today, it's about 75 degrees, which is above average. As you get down about 10 feet, it doesn't change much. Even 20 feet is still about the same as the surface, maybe a degree cooler. But as soon as you hit about 30 feet and below this lake, there is a sudden dramatic temperature drop. It drops down into the 30s. Just a little above freezing down there. It's a bitterly cold lake. And it never warms up down there. It stays that cold all year round. Well, there's nothing really growing in 30-degree temperature water. We don't get any algae or plant life down there. Bacteria is not exactly thriving, so all of these shipwrecks here are very well preserved. I mean, things don't even rust as quickly here as they would in, say, saltwater. So this is a diver's paradise. People come from all over to dive on Erie shipwrecks here. We have a whole lot of them. They're in very shallow water, and they're really well preserved. One of the more famous dive sites people like to dive on is the Indiana. The Indiana went down in the 1870s, about 10 miles north of where we're 1769, a French gentleman by the name of Louis Jolin came here, and with the help of an Iroquois guide, he charted this whole region. Well, then the French took notice. They came here and set up shop. They built a fort at the mouth of Mill Creek here, Fort de Presque. They also went around and built other forts in different areas of Pennsylvania. They went down to Pittsburgh and built Fort Duquesne, out to Franklin and built Fort Machal. Well, then the British started to pay attention. They're like, what are those French doing? And we can't have them claiming all that land, taking it over. So they decided they would send some men here to try to drive the French out. They enlisted the help of a young major I'm pretty sure that you heard of to lead those men. It was the young Major George Washington. George Washington and his men